But I really want to introduce Scott Van Broekhoven. Scott Van Broekhoven is a group leader at MIT Lincoln Lab. Scott's here to introduce our speaker today.
Thanks, Joel. That's appreciate the introduction. Really appreciate everybody joining today. I've been fortunate to be part of, I'm not muted, sorry. Very fortunate to be part of BWSI now for a number of years. I think this is a fantastic program and look forward to continue to meet and interact with the students here. We are very, very fortunate today to have a fantastic speaker, Dr. Nandini Iyer. Dr. Nandini Iyer is a principal research scientist within the Air Force. Her current role is with the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, where she is leading a team in the International Program Office, looking at life science and human performance, which it still is the central piece of kind of how the Air Force and the military operates, is really the human element. How do you improve that human element is really central to everything that we try to do. Dr. Nandini Iyer received her doctoral degree in speech and hearing sciences from The Ohio State University. I think this is interesting because our speaker tomorrow will be the director of the Lincoln Laboratory, Eric Evans, who's also a PhD from The Ohio State University. So we're well represented in the Big Ten schools. I'm also a Big Ten graduate as well. Her research focused on basic principles, whereas auditory systems exploited top-down processes to build missing information, incoming auditory signals. She has continued in that sort of research path in her time in the Air Force. She was awarded a very prestigious National Academy of Science postdoctoral position at AFRL, the Air Force Research Laboratory, where she did research on speech communications in complex listening environments. She has received a number of awards over the time of her service to the United States, and we're very fortunate to have Dr. Iyer join us today. Just two quick announcements before I hand it over to Nandini. First, make sure you stay on after her talk, as we will have obviously the teacher presentation, also any other announcements as part of this conversation today. And then Nandini has asked that we actually intersperse the Q&A throughout the discussion. So please post your comments in chat. I'll be monitoring the chat. I will call on any of you who have questions, and you'll have the opportunity to ask them during the discussion today, as opposed to just waiting to the end. So with that, Dr. Iyer, very fortunate to have you here today, and really looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to you today. I've been, like Scott said, I've spent the last about 5 years in London trying to do something different, not really research, but really funding the research and sort of directing the research in the life sciences and human performance area. As my job, in my job as an Air Force civilian. And so that's been really interesting and really fun to step outside my comfort zone from being a researcher to actually funding the research opportunity. And if we want to talk about that, I can tell you all about the fun stuff that we can do as Air Force civilians. So I want to start off today by sort of setting the stage for where human performance within the Department of Defense is. So it's the human performance is sort of a huge paradox, right? While we rely on the humans immensely during war fighting and war situations, they also sometimes are looked upon as the weakest link during this process. And in the past, there has been a lot of effort, and it's not surprising that they would actually be the weakest link, because they work in environments that you and I have never encountered, right? Like they work in high stress environments. It's often high stakes. Every single decision has huge consequences. It's very competitive, and life and death situations can be made in the matter of seconds. So these are really, really adverse environments that they are working in. So in the past, the DoD had often focused on just sort of improving the physical capability of airmen. So if you look at all the manuals from before, they would focus on improving the physical fitness. So they had to do a certain number of repetitions in terms of pull-ups and push-ups, and be able to run a certain distance in a certain amount of time, and so on and so forth. But I think now they have recognized that as they increase the complexity of warfare, as they increase the technology that's available to our airmen, they need to start focusing on other domains as well, including the cognitive and the social domain. So if you look at human performance, we define human performance in the past as a successful completion of a task within available performance capacity, and that's important. So in the past, they have focused on available performance capacity that meets or exceeds the mission demands. So it's always a success of a mission, but it is within the performance capability of a warfighter. However, I think as we move to more and more technologically complex warfighting environments, we have to think about humans as platforms. So this is a very, very old curve, an old graph that people in psychology are very used to dealing with. It's called the Yerkes-Dodson curve, and it basically plots performance or the level of performance as a function of time. So what you see in the black line, so if you look at this curve, what it suggests is at the beginning of time, when people come into the force, when they are just recruited as young airmen, this is the baseline performance that they come in with. Through months and months of training, what we can get them to is what we call their biological potential, and that is indicated by this green line over here. And we consider that performance level to be optimized. But now what we are demanding is not just optimizing the level, but we want an enhanced performance. We want to enhance or even sometimes augment their performance. And then this is also indication, in addition to thinking of, how do you optimize the performance first? How do you optimize training techniques? How do you hasten the training techniques and so on? And how do you enhance and augment the warfighter? What we also have to think about is periods when their performance is degraded and how to keep them at that peak performance level for longer periods of time. We want to keep them at this performance level for longer periods of time. And in the past, all of this, whether you're talking about warfighter survivability, you're talking about warfighter lethality, you're talking about mobility, all of this was done through technological means, right? So we either developed supreme technological platforms to take them faster to places, or we would give them weapons that would help them be more lethal and increase their survivability. But now I think the DoD has come to recognize that, we have reached sort of a peak of our technological capabilities, and there are other adversaries that are catching up to our technological capabilities. And we have to think beyond technology and think about exploiting the humans in that case. So if you look at all our guidance, we always focus on using the human as a platform, which means we are training the human to be its own sort of machine, if you will. And we do this through making them capable of rapid and effective decision making, through effective human machine teaming, through neuroscience and systems biology research. And then the other thing that we have to think about is also build resilience. So for today's talk, what I'm going to focus on is, like I said, I don't do research anymore. I fund research. So I'm going to pick three different topics that I am funding in these areas. Two of them are basically in the decision sciences. So it's neuroscience. One is neuroscience based, one is just pure decision science. And then I will talk about three of these projects individually, just give you a flavor for the kinds of stuff that the US Air Force is interested in, that the Department of Defense is interested in terms of augmenting the human. I guess I'll pause to see if there's any questions.
I guess I had one quick question, Nandini, if that's
Yeah.
okay. I'm not exactly clear what the x-axis is in that plot. The indicative time, what does that represent?
So that is just how good you are in terms of your performance. What peak level of performance are you reaching, right? Like, so it can be performance. It can be like, if you're talking about physiological things, it could be arousal level. The axes itself are sort of irrelevant. Like, so you can plot basically anything along this curve, right? Like, so it's a function of time. You can plot arousal level. You can plot stress hormones, for instance. And this is just a very generic curve that shows that human performance is basically an inverted U-shaped function. So there is a buildup, there's some amount of peak performance, and then because of the capabilities that are involved, muscle fatigue, due to the inability of the nerve cells to constantly keep firing, they have to drop off at some point. So that's all it shows. But it can really be anything on the X and Y axes.
That's helpful. Thank you.
We have another question in the room from a student.
Yeah.
So if like output is defined as like physical, cognitive, and social, like skill, I guess, of a person, how do you you said that you would like change a person. So how do you change a person to be better in one of those ways? Like, what are you doing to improve your subject?
So this is an excellent question. And this is a function of a lot of thought that we put into in terms of training, right? Like, so if you look at our training scenarios, I think if you go to and if you have ever the opportunity to go to any of the DoD research labs, I think you should go, because much of our training is still based on old platforms, right? And we are doing nothing much to train them on the cognitive realm or the social realm. Now, when you talk about cognitive realm, it's the ability to make better decisions, perhaps with the aid of technologies that are available today. So you can leverage a lot of artificial intelligence, machine learning procedures to make sure that all the options are available to the people. So it's about the speed of decision making, increasing the speed of decision making, and then using other techniques such as, like you could use biofeedback and such to kind of make them aware of the deficiencies that they are facing at that given time, right? So you could talk to them about, well, you are probably getting fatigued, so you need to take a step back or something like that. And when it comes to the social realm, that's really more about teaming with other airmen, or teaming with, in our case, we think about teaming with autonomous agents or artificial agents in order to accomplish a task. Does that help?
Yeah, we have one last question here from the room.
Yeah.
Hi. If you're trying to integrate all these technologies to help the humans and for the humans to serve as a platform, why not just replace the human with full autonomy? Why are you trying to fix a flawed system?
I don't think human is a flawed system. I think that's part of it, right? Like, I think, the machines are capable of a lot these days. And I think a lot of people are interested in scenarios where warfighting is essentially autonomous. So, like you've heard about this and you've seen this in Hollywood movies. certainly where people are sitting in their basements and, shooting off tanks or planes in other parts of the world. I will tell you right now that in the DoD, and in order to satisfy the Geneva Convention, that is not really a possibility. There has to be a human in the loop at all times, at least for right now. So right now, there is no thought of being completely autonomous in any way, shape, or form. There will always be a human in the loop. And I think it's sensible to do that because I don't know, I think AI and machine learning has come a long way, but things like, human elements, I think, are important. Things like empathy and reasoning and, like that gut feeling that you have, that's a little bit difficult to program in a machine, isn't it?
So maybe one more question on this slide, and then we'll
Yeah.
So Rohan D, do you
Yep.
want to unmute?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Rohan. I was wondering, so based on the previous questions about the x-axis of this graph, I was wondering if this
Yeah.
is like a short-term time scale, like is in like one interaction on the battlefield, or like a long-term time scale, like is in like the lifetime of a soldier.
So this is what we would classify as a session, right? Like, so if you bring people, of course, these are all experiments that are done in a lab, right? Like, so it depends on a session of an experimental session, an experiment that's being run in a lab. So for instance, the indicative time could be as much as 1 hour, as much as 2 hours, or depending on the length of the experiment. But these are very typical patterns that you will see regardless of the experiment you run. And regardless of the task that you're testing, because there is this waxing and waning, and if you can stretch this out, you will see this, right? Like you'll see this sort of oscillation that happens in the human where they go up and down and up and down, because it's very hard to maintain that performance, to maintain a plateau. Just because, like if you're talking about soldiers, for instance, running, muscles get fatigued, muscles have to, kind of get rid of all the toxins that build up. And so that's why you have to have the downtime for everything.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is great. So I'm going to just jump in, dive right into my first topic that I'm funding. And like I said, all these are based on basically thinking about how do we enhance the decision-making capabilities of our warfighter? How do we give them the advantage of decision superiority? So the first one is talking about discovering latent decisions. So one of the things that the Air Force is interested in, and I'm not sure how many of you have actually participated, maybe even in neuroscience experiments, or even had a class on neuroscience that talks about some of these models. But basically in neuroscience, we're really interested in what's going on in your brain, right? Like we are interested in how the brain process external stimuli. And how they come to make the cognitive decisions that we make. Like how do these decisions translate into actions, basically? So a very common model that is used to explain a lot of decision making processes is known as the evidence accumulation model. And it's really a very, very simple model. So basically, the evidence accumulation model says that if you have a stimulus that is presented to you at some point in time, right here, the person or the subject basically accumulates evidence at a certain rate. And once that evidence reaches a certain threshold, he will make a decision, he or she will make a decision. And this is the red line is the decision threshold. And following that decision, you will get a response. So it's a very simple model. It works for a wide variety of psychological experiments, especially those related to response times. So any kind of response time decisions are very well modeled using this evidence accumulation model. So that's what we are trying to do with, or this is what the PI is trying to do with the grant. They're trying to determine how do people make these simple sequential decisions, and can we figure out what the cognitive stages are in each of these decisions. One of the problems with the evidence accumulation model is that it does not extend to sequential decision tasks, right? So it's capable of explaining one particular decision and that's it. And then you have to reset the trial in order to do the next trial and so on and so forth. But these people, they are actually two very, very smart and bright researchers from the one is from the University of Groningen in Netherlands, Jelmer Borst, and the other one is from Utrecht University, Leander van Marnen. And what they use is integrating machine learning techniques that will allow them to kind of morph these evidence accumulation models and incorporate them with sequential decision tasks. So what they use is two very sophisticated statistical procedures, hidden semi-Markov model and multivariate pattern analysis. Have any of you, please raise your hand if you've heard of these or worked with these or dealt with these? Yes, I can't see, so someone will have to tell me the results of this. But basically, the hidden Markov model is, a probabilistic model that will basically predict something that you see that is hidden from an observable variable. So, for an example for this is that, like in England, it's very common that everyone knows that it rains all the time. Can I predict that it's going to rain based on the clothes that people are wearing? So are they wearing, rain boots? And can I predict the likelihood of it raining based on that simple observation that I've just made? So, and then the semi-Markov model is just a variant of that model in which every state you see has a sequence of observation, not just one observation, but sequence of observation. And then the multivariate pattern analysis just provides a way to extract temporal information from the EEG data. Now, one of the intriguing things about this grant is that, think about it this way. So if you know all the kernels that go into making a certain decision, if you know that making a certain decision involves 4 steps or 5 steps or a series of 6 cognitive processes, wouldn't it be interesting to train someone to exactly follow those steps so they can reach expert level performance faster? Or at least you can see whether or not they're reaching expert level performance. Because this is one of the biggest failures today of training paradigms, right? Whether I mean, like it happens to you guys. It's whether you're training for, like when you were in younger grades, but you're training for a math test, or you're training for, performance, a fighter pilot in the DoD. It's just basically repetition, and you keep doing it, and you keep doing it, and you keep doing it till your eyes are ready to to basically close and shut off the whole thing, right? But this is a good way to kind of approximate the goals that you're trying to achieve, at least on a neural level, so that you can reach that goal faster, or at least tell someone that they're closer to attaining the expert level behavior. Does that make sense? So I'm going to go in a little bit into the actual procedure of discovering these latent decision making, or like going into the actual kind of procedures by which it's done. So if you've experienced wearing an EEG cap, or if you've participated in doing EEG experiments, what they would typically do is fit your hair with a like a cap of some kind, the electrode cap of some kind, which is already pre-fitted with some electrodes, and they basically adhere the cap to your scalp by using some gel. So there's good contact between the scalp and the electrodes. And then they give you some tasks to perform, and they measure your performance while you're doing the task. Now, in this case, this data was collected when the person had to decide whether or not they were asked to recognize easy shapes or difficult shapes, or easy letters sequences or difficult sequences. So that was the task in this experiment that they were doing. Then what they do is they take each of the electrodes and they measure the actual voltages that are generated, and then they calculate over the scalp a distribution of those voltages. And using a PCA, a principal component analysis, what they're able to do is project onto these different scalp areas about where the most salient signals are. Now, the next stage of this procedure is going to taking the PCA of the EEG signal. So you see these bumps over here, all these bumps over here, and these lines, these dashed lines indicate the end of a trial. So this is one trial, this is the second trial, and this is the end of the third trial. Now, there's a theory when you're talking about EEG that says that the start of a processing stage, any kind of processing stage, any kind of cognitive processing that your brain is doing, is indicated by either a peak or a trough across all these different brain areas. So based on these signals, they can compute on a trial by trial basis a peak and a trough, which is then indicated, which they then take to highlight these different stages in the processing of the stimuli. So for instance, in this particular instance, trial 1, there are 5 processing stages. No, let me see. Did I count that right? Yeah, 5 processing stages. Same for this one, and similarly for this one. What you can do, this is where the hidden Markov model and the multivariate pattern analysis comes in handy, because they search for these peaks and troughs automatically in the signal on a trial by trial basis, and then help to pull it out. The other part of the multivariate pattern analysis is what I told you was the the distributions of the temporal distributions of these trials, right, of these different stages. So in this example, what you see is for this trial, for instance, between the 3rd and the 4th stage, there is a certain duration over here that you can then capture into a distribution, and this is what they plot over here. So you have these distributions plotted for each of these stages over here. And then what they do is they look at these things, and they don't do it in a biased way, but they do it in a systematic way. So what they do is that they pick the HSMM and MVPA model that are best fit to the data. So for example, in this case, they fit it with either a 5-stage model or a 6-stage model. And particularly in this case, I think they found that the best fit was for a 6-stage model instead of a 5-fit model. So that most of the data is accounted for by a certain number of stages. So here are the data. So what did they see in the data? Okay, so this is where we can all take a look at the data and figure out what happened in this case. So if you look at these stages, what they found is that this is encoding stage 1, encoding stage 2, familiarity, and this is these stages are named by kind kind of backward propagating and figuring out what the subjects are doing in each of these stages. So these are not random. These are once they get the number of stages, then they kind of decide about what the stages are and how they can best label the stages. So the labels are generated by the PI, but the data is actually done in sort of an unbiased, statistically solid way. So if you look at these stages, you look at these 3 stages, and then you look at the red, what's most apparent to you guys in this? Did someone unmute and tell me?
The retrieval and respiration is the largest one, but it also varies the most.
Exactly. So you can see the largest variation in this data set comes from the retrieval and representation stage. And if I tell you now that this one is from the easy condition and this one is the hard condition, it suddenly starts to make sense, right? So what they are showing over here is that some of the stages of the encoding, some of the cognitive stages don't change at all, right? Like, so for instance, there's very little variance across the first 3 stages. So encoding 1, 2, and familiarity have very little variance across them, across all the subjects and across all the trials. The largest variability is actually in the retrieval and representation stage. And even the decision stage, once you like look at the bars, they are not that different, neither is the response generation time. So what you can see here is that, this behavior that you get, or the response time that you get, is explained by a series of sequential cognitive processes that people have made in order to come to a particular response, in order to reach the response that they gave in this task. And this procedure, the hidden Markov model and the MVPA, gives you a way to automatically translate EEG recordings into a sequence of the evidence accumulation models. And what's really interesting is now when you look at this pattern, and if you look at this data generated by a novice, and you can then kind of fiddle around and figure out where the novice person is having the most problem, and figure out an intervention for that procedure, for that particular stage. Does that make sense?
Does I had a quick question, Nandini, and I'll ask.
Yeah.
Is that data from one person with sort of 4?
No, this is group average. So this is
Okay.
actually data from about 25 people, I think, that they were running for the study.
Okay.
And it's actually collapsed across. So when you talk about the target, they're actually collapsed. So they didn't find any differences between the easy and the difficult sequences for the shapes of like the easy or difficult condition for the shapes or the sequences. So they collapsed across the 2. So this is a good way of using, I think, statistical techniques and pairing them with existing psychological theory that has gone on, like for a long time, and it gives them a really interesting way to get insights into the cognitive stages that are occurring when a person makes a series of decisions or reaches, or before he or she takes an action or responds to a particular stimulus. And that really is the goal of neuroscience. The question that is still interesting is, so this is what happens. So this is the task that I described to you. Now, the question that they are addressing currently in their grant is that, can we integrate the findings from several different studies to identify what we call like, I would say kind of the primary seeds of cognitive stages, right? Like, so what are the different cognitive stages that you need to put together or string together to get a particular action? And once we can do that, we can create a library of such neural signatures that are associated with certain cognitive processes, and then use these libraries to kind of train our airmen better, so we can get them to the level of expertise. We can get them to a quantified level of expertise based on neural activities, instead of just, telling them to attain sort of a behavioral goal, which is just make sure that you land the plane, right? There's a lot of variables that change between, yes, a lot of people can land the plane, but we want to know what happens when, some of these things go wrong, and what happens when things do go wrong, and how we can change that. Okay, I'll pause here for a minute before I go on to the next one to take any questions if you have any.
Yeah, we have one question from the student here at MIT.
Yep.
Hello. Quick question on the data set for like the
Yeah.
experiments that were done. You said it was an average. How did you guys have like a diverse group of people that took this, and like how did you guys choose who was going to take this test?
No, unfortunately, it is not a diverse group. It was students at the university at Utrecht. If you've been to Utrecht, it's largely a very white population, so it's not a diverse group of students at all.
And going on to that question, do you think the data that you got from this could change based on if you had a more diverse group of like varying races, ethnicities, different kind of people?
Now, see, that's an interesting question, because I am not sure, right? One of the things that we try to do with training in the Air Force is trying to get people to a certain level. Now, I know that doesn't allow for diversity of thought or diversity of differences in the way you arrive at a certain decision. But that's a very interesting question. I don't know the answer to that. I would say that when it comes to like what we call these primitives in this cognitive stages, there shouldn't be much when it comes to the initial stages of cognitive processing, right? Like, so for instance, we all still see color the same way, we process sound in the same way. So when it comes to sensory and perceptual processing, I don't think those things will change too much. But when it comes to decision-making processes, then you would see a larger variability in those processes. And then it's a question of, should we keep the variability or should we train the variability out, right? Because there's a very, very predominant thought that says that you should keep the variability because it promotes diversity of thinking. And I firmly believe that to be the case, but I don't know if we will see these in these kind of what I call the primitives in cognitive stages, right? Because these are ways that people process the world in similar ways. Now, when it comes to more complex scenarios, maybe that would change, but I don't think in these very simple, like, recognize easy discrimination of shapes or easy discrimination of sequences, that a lot is going to change based on diverse backgrounds.
We have one more question.
Yeah.
I was wondering more about the specifics of the test. So is it similar to like landing a plane, or how different is it? Like, what did the test subjects actually do in the experiment?
Oh, yeah. So the test subjects, basically, it was a task where on a trial by trial, like, on each trial, they were given the first, like, for instance, the shape cases, they had to identify, there were 4 shapes in the easy condition. They had 4 shapes, and they were associated with different color. And one of them was the target shape. So like a red square was always the target shape. And they had to identify whether the red square was present or absent on a given trial. And then with the difficult situation, in the difficult shape condition, of course, the set size of the shapes increased, as did the color.
We have 2 more questions here if you're willing to answer them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. I need just one quick comment. We are at 1:15, so I just want to make sure you're sort of tracking the time. I want to be conscious of your time, Nandini.
Yeah.
So yeah, go ahead with the questions.
is there evidence to suggest that through training we can manipulate the time people spend in these phases, or are people after some point kind of set, or I guess, to be stuck in this, like after like some neuroplasticity is gone when they're younger? Like, can say a person who you're training, for example, kind of, there's no amount of training which could bring them up like several phases, or kind of rigidly set into how their mind works?
No, there's a lot of evidence to the contrary, right? Like, so the critical age hypothesis is sort of, there's a lot of things that happen during the critical period, but there's tremendous evidence from neuroscience nowadays that the brain is highly plastic and it can morph and change at any age, right? It gets harder, of course, the older you are, but it's capable of change. And certainly if you look at, traumatic events to the brain, that's certainly indicative that the brain can morph and change and adapt new patterns. So yeah, we don't believe that there's ever a plateau that people would reach, and there's always ways to change them. But that's a good question. We don't know for sure. We'll have to test that out. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
What's the significance of the labels on the graph? Do they have any significance pertaining to the data that you obtained?
Which one? The encoding 1, 2?
Not those.
Like
but
those?
On the left-hand side.
Oh, the target.
Yeah.
No, those were just, they're just like arbitrary labels given by the principal investigator. So this was something that really happened last year, and the PI was preparing for a presentation, and instead of going through all the explanation of trying to explain what the task was, he just wanted to focus on the statistical procedure. And he gave the random level, but basically the target 1 and 2 is just an easy and a difficult condition, which is why you see the difference in the retrieval and representation phase.
For questions here, thank you so much, Doctor.
Yeah, we have a couple of hand raises I see in the chat.
Yeah.
Are you okay with more questions on this topic, maybe? If so, Romesa, do you want to get your hand up?
Yeah. Bob asked an interesting question in the chat, and I was wondering about this too. But would this research be helpful in figuring out how we can teach and learn better at schools?
Yes, absolutely. So this is the one thing that I keep saying, right? Like a lot of progress that is made in the DoD can actually, like a lot of the grants we fund actually go over to the civilian sector because most of it is dual use and dual purpose. Actually, couple years ago, I funded a procedure in which a PI was looking at the ability to retrain. Like when you decide when do we retrain someone, right now it's very, very kind of thoughtless, right? Like the way we retrain people, we just do it once a year. Like if you're talking about cardiac, like the American Heart Association, for instance, they say you have to resuscitate people. And in order to do that effectively, you have to come once a year, you get trained and you get certified and you're good to go. But that's really not the case, right? Like it depends on a lot of things, on how effectively you were trained in the first phase. And we've done through a series of scientific investigations, we've actually found that it has more to do with how fast you learn. So the steepness of the learning curve and the steepness of the decay curve. And once you know those two parameters, it's very easy to predict when you need to get retrained, right? Like, so these are all examples of science that, yes, it's funded by the DoD, it's applicable to our situation, but it's also hugely applicable to the general population.
Maybe one more question on this topic and then keep going, or do you want to move on, Nandini? What's your preference?
Let me move on to the next one and I can stop with the next topic, but I think the next topic is also intriguing because it's something that has to do with current events and the way we think about things right now. So can I just go really quickly through my next couple slides, and then I will stop there and you can ask questions?
That sounds great.
Yeah? Okay. So the other kind of grant that we are talking about, it's the same way, and it deals with decision making, right? So when you're talking about decision making, you're talking about uncertainty being a big part of our life, right? Like you don't know whether it's going to rain today. You don't know. I mean, I know in Boston it's hot for the past like 2 months, but in England, every day that's a question. Is it going to rain today? Should I take an umbrella with me? So these are all uncertainty, which is an intrinsic part of your life. And the key question in behavioral science is trying to model how the mind deals with these kinds of uncertainty. How do humans process uncertainty, and how do we deal with uncertainty? Now, there's a lot of people who believe that humans are intrinsically very, very unscientific when it comes to dealing with uncertain information. And there's a lot of proof for that I will go through. But basically, when you're talking about probabilistic inferences, or the way that we make decisions about what the outcome is given an uncertain situation, you're talking about three main theories, right? Like you're talking about the classical probability theory, also known as the Bayesian hypothesis, Bayesian theory. You're talking about heuristics and biases. And here's a question for you guys. Do you know a Nobel Prize winner who won a prize for his heuristic and biases theory?
I don't see anything in the
No.
chat right now. I'm guessing it's a
Okay.
some of the economics domain.
Yes, it's Daniel Kahneman. So he won a Nobel Prize based on his heuristic and biases, I think fast and slow, all those kinds of theories that he propagated. And so this is again to show you that there's a lot of research that goes on in decision. Actually, there are 3 people who won Nobel Prizes based on decision-making theories. So it's not true that you cannot win a Nobel Prize in psychology. And then the other one is a relatively new one, which is the one I'm funding, that is on quantum probability theory. So a quantum probability theory is actually really simple. It's just a local Bayesian theory that is applied to a smaller set or subspace in your decision-making space. So I'll go real quickly through this. So when you talk about the quantum probability theory, we talk very quickly about the Linda problem. And I hope has anyone heard about the Linda problem? This is the part that Kahneman actually put forward when you're talking about the Linda problem. So you can give people this task and you tell people that Linda is a woman who is outgoing, concerned with equality, is intellectually very curious. What people will do is often pick Linda as a feminist bank teller, right? So she is a feminist who is also a bank teller. So they always pick Linda. A huge proportion of people pick Linda to be this intersection of a feminist bank teller. Now, this is inherently wrong. And it's because if you give this in a more simple, if you give the same kind of exercise in a more simple case, these inferences become intractable really fast, right? Like, so you can do the same thing with Scandinavians having blonde hair and blue eyes. And you will find experiment after experiment that the probability that Scandinavians, when people are asked about Scandinavians having blonde hair and blue eyes, people will rate or rank the probability of having blonde hair and blue eyes greater than the probability of blonde hair, which is a fallacy because one is a subset of the other, right? And you can never have bigger numbers in a subset than you do in the entire set. So this is what we refer to as the conjunction fallacy. So this is kind of a problem because, you would think that, when you're talking about and scientists have kind of brushed this off saying that, people are sort of irrational, and Bayes inference only works when people are using the irrational portion of decision making. But on the other hand, we have recent events that have occurred nowadays, and this is something that the military faces constantly, is information overload. So whenever you have information overload, Bayes' hypothesis somehow fails, given the number of decisions you have to make. Given if you're presented with more and more options, your ability to make sound decision becomes increasingly poor. So one of the things that happened recently is, this is the classic example of the Brexit problem. And my PI, who is working on this thing, believes it's because people have heuristics and biases that they are using to base their decisions, right? Like, so for instance, when you're talking about Brexit, it was so divided over here. People who cared about immigration only voted a certain way. People who cared about their national healthcare system voted a certain way. So they all have their biases, and they were looking at the problem through their lens, because we are never, fully well versed with all the options that are available to us, right? We think we have it because we have access to all these tools, and we have access to all this information, but we are really not experts in this area. So we get more and more, the more insight you have to these problems, the more biased you become, and then the less Bayesian you become. So this is the experiment that my PI is running right now, is to decide which pieces of information can be considered Bayesian versus quantum. Is there a threshold? If people are asked to make certain decisions, is there a dimension at which, Bayesian hypothesis just fails? If it's probably just two choices, people are probably very good at making these decisions. But when it comes to multidimensional decision with the cost and reward for every single action, then it becomes very difficult for people to make such decisions. And then, how do people update the probabilities when you present more and more and more information? So there are lots of challenges in this grant that still remains to be answered, but I'm very excited about this project because it's a new project, and it presents a different way of making and arriving at decisions. And one of the challenges that is there is there a way to prevent the less is more effect? And this is something that, someone from the audience just raised, right? Like, so you just if you get more and more information about a certain situation, do you just get fed up and just stick to your original decision? So you're not updating your probabilities at all, right? Is there, so the other thing that you also see with this kind of quantum decision is that you see these order effects, right? So so they did this study in which they asked people, do you like Bill Clinton or do you like Al Gore better? And they found that the probability of choosing Clinton was higher when Clinton came second, when Clinton was second in the list of candidates that was provided to the people. And actually, when Al Gore was provided second after Clinton, his likability also dropped. So there are these weird order effects that you can see when you're thinking about quantum information. And can we then exploit it in order to kind of minimize the biases that people have formed when you're talking about fake news or all these kind of truthiness kind of things that are going on these days in the media? And can we mitigate the failures appropriately? Like, how can we get people to update probabilities? How can we move them from a spot where they're not updating the probabilities appropriately? And then the other thing, the last one that we need to think about is that, AI systems and machine learning systems, do they need to be endowed with quantum cognition? Do they need to think the way that humans do? I would say for some applications, they absolutely need to think like humans do. In other applications, maybe it's not so important. So I'll stop at that. I'll talk about something else later, but I wanted to stop at this because I am in an international location. And I want you guys to know that there are plenty of science to be explored all over the world, and you should come and explore it.
That's great. That was a fascinating talk, Dr. Iyer. There's a bunch of questions in the chat. We are at basically 1:29 on my clock. So I think maybe I'll try and take one question from the students, and then we'll do the teacher presentation, and then we can find the best way to follow up with you afterwards with any other questions the students might have as well.
Yes, that would be
Okay.
great.
Let me see. I'm going to mispronounce this name. Akshay, are you online? Do you want to ask your question?
Yes. So thank you so much for your talk today. It was very informative. I just had a quick question about how much you think that future political campaigns will be influenced by quantum models and about the rise in AI and all of that.
I think that is one of the biggest push for this investigator that I'm funding, to actually make these quantum models available online so they can immediately see the fallacy of their thinking, right? And that's one of the ways to bring open science into the social media platform and make things completely transparent.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Joel, should I turn it over to you, or do you want me to do the introduction for the presentation?
Hey, Scott, can we do just one more question?
Sure.
By Pius Lee. It's an interesting question, actually. So,
hi. What are the moral ramifications of using humans as test subjects for military applications?
Humans as test subjects for military applications.
Like the moral ramifications.
So we don't ever test in real operational scenarios, right? So they are never asked to kill someone or shoot at someone or anything like that, because that would never go through our IRB. It would never pass the IRB consent process. We always go to experimental tasks that mimics military scenarios, right? So it involves the components, it captures the basic essence of military operations without actually doing the military operations, because they would never allow us to do it, first of all. And in those cases, we will recruit military people to run our studies, right? Like, so when it comes to complete military use. But I don't fund those, because those kinds of studies are done in the research labs. So they are done at the research labs and they're not done in academia.
Joel,
All right, thank you very much. I would like to ask two students from the analytics course to be ready with their video here. Both Priya Iyer, and Yash Gouda. If you can unmute, and I believe you guys are giving the presentation of the t-shirts. If you want to go ahead and present the t-shirt and say something about the speech, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. And it was really interesting to see how machine learning can fit into the areas like decision-making and neuroscience and the questions and opportunities that arise from that. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. And I'm glad to present to you a BWSI shirt.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you also for your time. I really enjoyed learning about the application specifically of machine science, and also really liked the talk about the quantum decision making and the different fallacies and probabilities at the end. So I'd also like to present to you a BWorks shirt.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate your time.
Scott, do you have anything else? Bob?
No, I would just say this was a fantastic talk. There was a lot of questions in the chat we didn't get to. Very engaged audience. It was obviously something that really hit a chord with the students, and we'll take some of those questions that were in the chat and forward it to you over email, Nandini. But really, thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. I would really appreciate that. I'd love to answer some of these questions.